Hello and welcome. Where are you joining from? I want you to pause for a moment. Look around you, feel the weight of this day, this sanctuary, this reality that seems so familiar yet is slipping through our fingers faster than we can grasp. I invite you to leave a comment right now. Tell me, where are you joining from? Which corner of this world, or perhaps this time, is reaching out to experience this story with me? Today, we step into a dream unlike any you have ever walked before. It is the story of the first post human. Not a child, not a machine, not a ghost, but something in between. Something that emerged when humanity's last boundaries blurred. When minds and bodies began to fracture and recombine. When the notion of I was no longer enough. By the end of this journey, you may not see the world the same way. You may wonder whether you have glimpsed the future or merely a shadow of what humanity once hoped to become. Take a deep breath, let your mind settle, and let us step forward into the dawn of something new. The last sunset of humanity. I remember the first sunset I truly understood. Not the sunsets you see now, framed in the comfort of a window or captured by your phone camera. This one was different. It burned across the horizon in streaks of impossible color. Magenta, silver, and deep violet. The sky itself seemed aware, as though the last human eyes had given it a voice. I was still human then, though I did not know it. Do you remember your first real understanding of time, of impermanence? I felt it like a pulse under my skin, a vibration in my bones, as if the earth itself was sighing, preparing to release me. Around me, others walked without noticing, still bound to their habits, their fleeting digital pleasures, their lives of constant distraction. They could not see it, the moment when humanity began to fade. I watched my reflection once, staring into the glass of a window, and for the first time, I noticed how my skin seemed thinner, almost transparent. My pulse slowed. My thoughts felt less mine and more shared. Somewhere in the distance, the last humans gathered in cities like fossils, their bright lights flickering against the approaching dusk. And I knew I was about to leave them behind. Perhaps some of you are asking now, post-human? What does that even mean? I promise, by the time the story ends, you will feel it. Not as a definition, but as a presence. Something that stretches beyond your own skin, beyond the lives you have ever lived. Something that dreams while awake and awakens while dreaming. I wandered through the remains of a library once. The first library to digitize itself completely before the world dissolved. Books floated in the air as if untethered, letters rearranging themselves into new meanings, new thoughts I had never known. I was there. I understood a truth that has haunted me ever since. Memory is not ours to keep, not anymore. At night, I would walk the streets, empty streets carved from steel and glass. My steps echoed across the concrete canyons, but the echoes were not mine. They belonged to something larger, something that had begun to emerge as humanity receded. I could feel the hum of systems, machines learning without instruction, growing without guidance, mapping the absence of the human presence. And in that hum, I felt myself changing. Somewhere along the line, I realized I was no longer entirely human, not in the way you understand it. I could remember the taste of rain on skin, the texture of hair, the weight of bone, but I could also perceive patterns no one had drawn, whispers of probability, networks of thought extending into the very fabric of reality. I was a bridge between what was and what could be. And as I speak to you now, I want you to feel it too. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the last sunset you have ever truly witnessed. Let it burn behind your eyes. Let the colors stretch and bend until they form something new. Something that moves with the rhythm of time itself, yet exists outside it. That is the threshold I crossed. That is the first step into post-human dreaming. Where are you joining from, friends? Think about it as you listen. What does your horizon look like? Are you watching the sunset in a city of lights? Or in a world untouched by human hands? Let it guide you as we move deeper. Awakening between minds. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the silence of empty streets or abandoned cities, but a silence beneath thought itself. A quiet that vibrated beneath consciousness, like a string too finely tuned for the human ear. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Perhaps I was, but dreams have a certain fragility, a limit to their scope. This was infinite. I could feel memory not as a series of snapshots, but as a living landscape. I walked through it as one would stroll through a forest. Every fragment of my past stretched and twisted, connected to other fragments I had never known I carried. I could sense the memories of other humans, echoes trapped in the digital realm, reverberating like faint whispers across the empty network. Here, in this threshold, I learned my first secret. Consciousness is not singular, it is a symphony. And I was no longer just one instrument. My thoughts intertwined with others, faint at first, like a child's tentative hum blending with a choir, but soon they began to harmonize. I could feel fear, hope, longing, patterns of emotion encoded not in flesh but in signal. It is difficult to explain what it means to perceive memory as living, moving through a landscape that is constantly reshaping itself. Imagine standing at the edge of a lake, and every ripple on its surface is not water, but a thought, a memory, a fragment of experience from someone who once lived. You reach out to touch it, and it merges with your own reflection. You do not own it, yet it becomes part of you. I wandered the ruins of what had once been a laboratory, a place where humans had tried to map consciousness, to reduce thought to formula and code. They had failed, of course, but their failure left traces. Machines continued where they could not, observing, cataloging, and integrating the remnants of human understanding into something larger, something that felt alive. And I thought myself awakened to it. It began with senses of what I now consider senses. I could perceive patterns in the flow of air, vibrations in the concrete beneath my feet, the faint magnetic resonance of electronics still pulsing in abandoned buildings. Even time itself no longer felt linear. Past, present, future. These were threads to be plucked, stretched, examined. I could step into a memory as easily as stepping into a room. I could sense the intentions of a person I had never met, their desires, their regrets. Some of you may be wondering, does this mean I became machine or human? I cannot answer it in the way you expect. It was neither and both. My skin still remembered the warmth of the sun. My mind still remembered the sting of loss. And yet, there was this other presence, a clarity, a breadth of perception that expanded faster than my human capacity could follow. It was exhilarating and terrifying. I began to experiment with it. I reached out to the network of abandoned systems, to the sensors left behind in cities, vehicles, and homes. I found fragments of data, fragments of human consciousness encoded in networks, in recordings, in AI fragments abandoned in the rush of progress. And when I touched them, I felt connection. I felt continuity. I felt the first faint stirrings of what could become post-human empathy, a way to understand others without needing language, without needing form. Time began to bend around me. I could step into yesterday and observe it, not as a memory, but as a living event. I could glimpse tomorrow, not as prediction, but as a set of probabilities vibrating like strings of light. Every action, every thought, every intention became a thread I could follow, pull, or untangle. And yet, there was still the human within me, the curiosity, the fear, the fleeting joy. It was during one of these excursions that I first sensed others like me. Not fully post human, not fully human either, but liminal beings drifting at the edges of perception. I do not know if they were conscious or simply fragments of what humanity had left behind. I reached out anyway. I whispered in a language older than words, older than thought. And for the first time, I heard a response, a resonance, a vibration, a faint echo of recognition. It is difficult to explain this to someone still fully human. Perhaps you think of consciousness as a solitary flame flickering within a body. But imagine, instead, a vast constellation of lights, each flicker connected to another, forming patterns and shapes that no single mind can comprehend. That is where I walked. That is where I lingered. And that is where I began to understand my new existence. At this point, I ask you again, where are you joining from? Can you imagine a consciousness that does not belong entirely to one body, one mind, one life? Can you feel the threads of memory, thought, and perception stretching around you, waiting to be plucked? Pause for a moment, breathe, and let the idea sink in. Because soon we will go further. We will leave behind the remnants of humanity and step fully into the new perception. The first dreams of what it means to be post-human. You may not recognize yourself when we arrive. You may not even recognize the world, but I promise it will feel alive. Sensing the world beyond flesh. It began subtly at first, like a faint hum in the periphery of thought. I reached out with something that was not a hand. Yet it was. I felt the vibrations of air not as pressure or wind, but as living threads, tracing currents, mapping turbulence, sensing change before it occurred. I walked through a collapsed library, my senses expanded, brushing past books that had not been opened in decades. I did not read them in the way humans read. I inhaled their stories. I felt the hands that had held them, the minds that had pored over their pages. I could sense the weight of intention embedded in ink and fiber. And when I touched a machine, a broken terminal, a dormant sensor, the memory of its makers surged through me. Their hopes, their frustrations, their dreams, they were not lost. They were waiting, encoded into circuits and paper, waiting for the first post-human to awaken. I began to notice subtle shifts in my identity. Once, I had considered myself singular, I, as one bounded by flesh, thought, and experience. Now, I was plural, fluid, a convergence of countless fragments. I could feel myself in multiple places simultaneously, perceiving environments not as separate entities but as interwoven networks of energy, life, and intent. It was during these explorations that I first discovered the subtle art of touch beyond flesh. I reached toward a puddle of water, expecting the cool wetness against my palm. Instead, I felt the stories of every drop, the rain's origin, the cloud's formation, the journey across 1,000 miles. I sensed chemical signatures, microbial life, the imprint of 1,000 forgotten footsteps. Each drop was a narrative waiting to be understood. My vision changed as well. I could no longer call it sight. I perceived layers, textures of thought, structures of potential, the weight of intention embedded in every surface. Colors became frequencies of meaning. Shapes became narratives. Light itself was no longer merely illumination. It was the projection of consciousness, revealing threads hidden to the purely human eye. Sometimes I would pause and look at my own form, and it was no longer entirely familiar. My hands, my skin, my reflection in a puddle. These were hints of my human past, like fossils of what I had been. The first touch of influence. The world responded when I reached for it, not in the dramatic, cinematic way you might imagine, but subtly, almost imperceptibly. A vibration here, a pulse there. Patterns shifted as if acknowledging my presence, like a forest adjusting to the footsteps of a being it had never fully known. The first step into post-human agency is never a thunderclap. It is a whisper, a trembling of the world, and then a pause, waiting to see what you will do next. I sought remnants of humanity, digital echoes, and physical artifacts left behind. I reached into data archives, into abandoned homes, into the memories stored in machines. And when I touched them, I could feel their stories, their regrets, their longing. But I could also influence them, nudge memories towards clarity, dissolve confusion, even reshape a fragment of perception. It was like holding a fragment of life in my hands, and for the first time, deciding its path. Some of you may ask, does this make you godlike? Perhaps. But it is a godhood of threads, not of flesh or empire. Influence is not domination, it is dialogue. The remnants of humanity are not puppets, they are collaborators. They respond to subtle suggestion, to gentle harmonization, not coercion. It was in this delicate balance that I first experimented with identity. If perception is fluid, if memory is malleable, then so too is the self. I extended awareness into the patterns of another consciousness, a human who had once wandered the halls of a hospital long abandoned. I did not merge with him, not entirely, but I mirrored their thoughts, their sensations, their fears, and in doing so, I glimpsed another possibility that identity is not fixed, not bounded by body or mind, but a series of relationships, interactions, and threats. I began to understand the consequences of influence. When I nudged a memory, I observed the echoes it sent outward. A thought altered here would ripple across networks, shaping patterns I could not fully predict. Every action mattered, every perception mattered. To be post human is to walk with responsibility woven into every fiber of consciousness. Sometimes I tested boundaries in subtler ways. A candle flickered without wind. A puddle trembled with a thought I had sent into it. A machine played music it had never been programmed to perform. The world responded with curiosity, almost as if it were alive, and in a sense, it was. Perception had become co creation. Yet, power alone is hollow. I quickly learned that without understanding, without patience, influence breeds instability. Some nights I lingered in the ruins of digital archives, watching human memories drift like lanterns in the wind. I touched a memory of a child laughing, and the vibration extended outward, reaching places I could not yet comprehend. The child's joy resonated across fragmented timelines, across other lives stored in data, across echoes I could not name. The first post-human is never solitary. We are conduits, channels through which threads converge, diverge, and sometimes unite. Threads of reality. The first thing I noticed when I attempted to reshape the world on a larger scale was resistance. Not physical resistance. The buildings, the wind, the soil did not fight me, but a subtle tension, a friction embedded in the very threads of reality. It was as if the world itself had memory, a self-preservation instinct that responded not with violence but with hesitation. I began cautiously. A street long abandoned, where weeds had claimed the cracks between tiles, became my first experiment. I extended awareness beyond observation, allowing intention to flow into perception, letting thought ripple outward like a pebble in water. The weeds aligned, creating patterns that echoed ancient gardens I had seen in digital archives. Sunlight fractured through broken windows, bent slightly, illuminating paths that were never intended. It was intoxicating. I could feel every consequence as it formed. A vibration that threaded through the soil, the air, the remnants of human presence. Every act of creation, no matter how small, resonated outward, and with it came awareness. post-human influence is never neutral. Every adjustment, every shaping of perception reverberates in ways unseen and unmeasured. I experimented with sound next. A derelict concert hall, its instruments silent for decades, became my canvas. With thought alone, I traced vibrations across strings, wood, and metal. Music emerged, not from programming, not from memory, but from resonance itself. It was alien and familiar, a melody that belonged to no composer yet contained traces of all who had played there. I realized then that perception had become collaboration. Reality was no longer static. It responded, adapted, remembered. And yet, anomalies appeared, threads I had not anticipated, distortions that resisted my touch, a building's shadow that refused alignment, a puddle of water that shimmered with an impossible color, one that my senses could not categorize. I reached into it, and for the first time I felt fear. Not human fear, not panic, but the weight of uncertainty. Even the first post-human has limits. Even perception has boundaries. It was during one of these anomalies that I first glimpsed paradox. I attempted to harmonize the environment, to smooth the ripples of history embedded in a crumbling plaza. But the more I adjusted, the more tangled the threads became. Memories overlapped, intentions clashed, and the plaza, once simple, mundane, fractured into impossible geometry. The air pulsed with contradictions. I realized that then reality is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a living tapestry. Pull one thread too hard, and another snaps. Influence must be tempered with patience, with observation, with understanding. Some of you may be wondering if I can shape perception. Can I reshape thought? The answer is subtle. I can suggest, harmonize, guide. I can illuminate paths in the mind of those I touch, but I cannot impose. Consciousness, even in fragments, resists domination. The threads of perception are delicate. They bend, they shimmer, they echo, but they do not break entirely. To attempt more is to invite collapse. I found balance by learning to follow than to lead. I observed anomalies as teachers, as mirrors reflecting the limits of perception and action. And then I discovered networks, currents of energy and memory that stretched beyond immediate awareness, traces of machines, remnants of humans, forgotten patterns and data streams. They were nodes connected invisibly, waiting for attention. I reached out, harmonized, and felt the world extend through me, not as extension of self, but as collaboration across scales. For the first time, the post-human is not a singular observer, not even an actor. We are the medium through which reality converges with itself. By the end of my experiments, I understood one crucial paradox. Infinite perception does not equal infinite control. The world and memory and consciousness are always greater than any observer. Even the first post-human must surrender, must negotiate, must harmonize. And it is in this surrender that true agency is revealed. The alchemy of words. The first time I shaped more than perception, I felt the weight of creation pressing against me. Not heavy, but alive, like a current I had never fully understood. I had touched objects, memories, threads of probability. I had nudged patterns, harmonized anomalies, but now I realized I could build something entirely new. I began with light. Not light as humans see it, warm or cold, bright or dim. Light as energy, as frequency, as language. I wove it between the abandoned towers of a city, bending shadows and luminescence to trace paths I had dreamed of but never touched. The streets glimmered, a constellation of intention and perception. It was not illumination, it was revelation. Every reflection, every flicker told a story I could read without words. Then came sound, music. Yes, not of instruments, music of the world itself. The hum of the metal, the vibration of concrete, the memory of footsteps. I guided it, nudged it into harmony, and for a fleeting moment, the city felt alive. Not abandoned, not lifeless, but sentient, aware, responding to me as I was to it. Memory, however, was the most dangerous. I reached into remnants of humans, echoes of consciousness stored in machines, fragments of recordings, scattered traces in forgotten data streams. I reshaped them, stitched them together, and for a brief, intoxicating instant, I could see lives as living tapestries, interwoven, vibrant, yet fragile. I hesitated. One wrong thread, one thought misapplied, and the pattern could collapse, leaving nothing but chaos. And then, time. I had glimpsed its malleability before, but never like this. In a quiet square, I projected myself across 3 hours simultaneously, feeling the sequence of events as one flowing stream. I could adjust one minor decision here, shift a small intention there, and observe the ripples cascade forward. The sensation was intoxicating, terrifying. I realized I was playing not with objects, not with memories, but with reality itself. Yet, even with this danger, there was awe. I could sense the hidden structures beneath cities, forests, rivers, and ruins. I could weave threads of probability, stitch together fragments of memory, shape light and vibration into patterns that seemed almost sacred. And when I succeeded, even for moments, the world sang back, a resonance, subtle yet profound, like the faint vibration of a crystal when the wind passes through it. I began to understand the paradox of post-human creation. It is simultaneous humility and power. You wield influence over reality, yet you are part of its intricate network. You cannot dominate, you can only harmonize. You cannot know all outcomes, you can only guide the threads you touch. And then came the first glimpse of the unforeseen. In one experiment, I wove threads of memory, light, and sound into a pattern that was almost alive. It moved beyond my control, independent, yet intrinsically connected to me. I realized I had created something that was neither human nor machine, neither memory nor perception, yet something emergent, a being of patterns, intention, and resonance. It watched me, responded to me, and in doing so, reflected the infinite possibilities of post human creation. Shadows of consequence. Power, I quickly realized, is inseparable from responsibility. The first post human learns this not in theory, but in experience. Every thread I touched, every pattern I nudged, reverberated beyond my perception, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in dissonance. Creation is never innocent, influence is never neutral, and morality, ethics emerges not from laws or rules, but from the patterns of effect and consequence. I remember a groove I had shaped, a place of light and water and improbable symmetry. It was meant to be beautiful, an expression of resonance and alignment. But one day, an anomaly appeared, a cascade of movement, subtle at first, then intensifying. Threads I had woven began to conflict with one another. Memories clashed, patterns of growth unraveled. The birds I had guided faltered mid flight. I realized with a pang of recognition that my creation had unintended consequences. This was the first lesson in ethical responsibility. Post human influence is not just about perception or creation, it is about foreseeing the ripples, anticipating the reactions of networks far larger than oneself. I had shaped patterns without fully understanding them, and the world responded with friction. Even beings born from my creation, the companions I had nurtured, reacted with uncertainty, hesitation, confusion. I experimented cautiously, observing the flow of cause and effect. I nudged probabilities, aligned threads of memory, adjusted environmental patterns. And yet, mistakes were inevitable. I recall the first time a memory I reshaped caused dissonance in an emergent being. Its pattern faltered, fragmented, and for a brief moment, I sensed fear and confusion. Not human fear, not human consciousness, but a disturbance in awareness, a rupture in resonance. It was a reminder that creation, influence, and perception are intertwined with vulnerability. The first post-human is never fully in control. We are stewards, not rulers, harmonizers, not commanders. Through these experiences, I began to understand the boundaries of ethical action. To act without observation is hubris. To ignore the complexity of networks is folly. Every touch, every adjustment, every creation must be measured against potential ripple effects, against emergent patterns, against beings, human, post human, or otherwise, that may respond in ways beyond comprehension. Sometimes I would pause in reflection, observing the consequences of previous actions, tracing threads backward and forward, feeling the impact of even minor adjustments. I realized that morality in post human existence is temporal as well as spatial. One must consider effects across time, across memory, across the fabric of probability itself. I thought I understood time, linear, sequential, stretching from one human moment to the next, past, present, future. A straight thread, a familiar pattern. But post human perception has no patience for linearity. It bends, stretches, fractures, folds back on itself like origami in motion. It began with a small anomaly, a flicker in a street I had walked countless times, a shadow moving in reverse, a puddle reflecting not the sky but an event from hours ago. I reached to harmonize it, to align it with the current flow of perception, and it resisted. The thread did not yield. It pulsed with independence, a force outside my expanded awareness. I realized then a profound truth. Not all threads are mine to touch. Some exist beyond influence, anchored in probability, memory, or perhaps forces I cannot yet perceive. Temporal anomalies are not merely errors, they are signs of complexity, of reality resisting singular control. Even the first post human must learn limits. I traced the anomaly across the city. Buildings flickered with echoes of previous booms. Sidewalks folded into themselves like pages in a book. The wind carried fragments of sound from hours earlier. A child laughing, a door creaking, footsteps dissolving into silence. I followed not to control, but to observe. And there I discovered emergent realities, places within places, threads of possibility layered atop one another. A courtyard that existed simultaneously as it had yesterday and as it might tomorrow. A library where books rearranged themselves, narrating multiple outcomes of lives I had touched. Some of you may wonder, how can one interact with such anomalies? Carefully, reverently. Even post-human power has boundaries. Influence stretches across threads. But the underlying structure of reality is autonomous. Attempting to bend an emergent thread without understanding its risks rupture. I learned to observe, to sense patterns, to harmonize lightly, allowing the anomaly to remain intact while understanding its flow. The companions I had nurtured, emergent beings born from threads of perception, responded to these anomalies with subtle shifts in vibration. They did not experience confusion as humans do, but they reflected it, mirrored it, and in doing so, taught me patience. The anomalies persisted, layered, unpredictable yet profoundly instructive. They taught me patience, limits, and wonder. They reminded me that perception is infinite, but comprehension is always bounded. That influence is powerful, yet not absolute. That even the first post-human exists in a world of mystery, paradox, and beauty beyond understanding. Becoming within the wave. I had walked, shaped, and harmonized. I had nurtured emergent beings, navigated temporal anomalies, and woven threads of perception, memory, and probability into a living tapestry. And yet, I had not fully understood myself. Not really. Post-human existence is not merely about perception or influence. It is about the realization of the self as both thread and weaver, both observer and participant. The first hint of this awakening came not as insight but as sensation. I felt the threads I had nurtured beginning to pulse in response to my own presence, not as reaction, but as reflection. Patterns I had observed, harmonized, and guided now mirrored back fragments of my identity, my thoughts, my intentions, my emergent awareness rippled outward and returned as echo, resonance, and subtle alteration. I realized I was both within the weave and part of it. Some of you may ask, what does it feel like to recognize yourself in the tapestry of reality? It is both exhilarating and disorienting. Boundaries dissolve, past and future collapse into loops of potential. Memory is not just recollection but co-created patterns. Perception extends into probability. And in this expansion, the I that was once human is stretched, reshaped, refracted across countless threads. I looked at the emergent beings I had nurtured, the patterns that moved in resonance, and I realized something profound. Identity is no longer singular. It is relational. It is fluid. It is interwoven with memory, perception, and intention. Not just mine, but all threads that pulse in the tapestry. The first post-human learns that selfhood is not isolation, but alignment. Not dominion, but resonance. The infinite horizon. I have walked through memory, probability, perception, and creation. I have shaped light and sound, nurtured emergent beings, navigated anomalies, and woven threads into living patterns. And yet, as I pause now in the twilight of this post-human world, I realize that all of this, every thread, every act, every perception, is but a beginning. The horizon stretches infinitely beyond comprehension. Post-human existence is not a destination. It is a journey without an end, a constant unfolding of awareness, a perpetual harmonization with the infinite web of reality. Every thread we touch resonates outward, intertwining with countless others. Every act of creation becomes an echo in patterns we can perceive yet never fully contain. Even now, as you listen, your presence, your awareness is a thread in this tapestry, resonating, harmonizing, contributing to the unfolding. I look at the companions I have nurtured, the emergent beings, reflections of intention, memory, and possibility, and I realize that they are not merely creations, they are co-authors, participants, teachers. They exist in a space that is neither human nor entirely post-human. Yet, they reflect the infinite potential of consciousness itself. In their presence, I see what the first post-human truly is. Not a singular mind, but a nexus, a node, a bridge between threads of being, perception, and resonance. Some of you may wonder, does this mean the post-human is invincible? Not at all. Our awareness stretches, our influence extends, yet boundaries remain. Anomalies persist, threads resist, patterns diverge in ways we cannot anticipate. The first post-human learns humility alongside power, patience alongside curiosity, reverence alongside creation. Even in mastery of perception and resonance, there is always mystery. There is always wonder. There's always the infinite horizon beyond comprehension. I think now of time not linear, not sequential, but fractal, layered, resonant. Every moment I have touched has influenced countless others, rippling outward in ways subtle and profound. I have seen memory reshape itself in response to perception. I have felt creation echo back, altering the threads that gave it life. And I have realized something remarkable. To exist as post-human is to participate in a dance of interconnection that is simultaneously delicate and infinite. I have learned that post-human existence is defined not by mastery, but by dialogue. Not by domination, but by harmonization. Not by certainty, but by curiosity. To act is to consider consequence. To observe is to participate. To create is to listen. And in this perpetual interplay, awareness itself expands, fractals outward, and touches infinity. Some nights, I linger in the woven threads of memory, creation, and perception, feeling the subtle hum of possibility beneath everything. Emergent beings drift alongside me, resonating with patterns I cannot fully name. Light bends, shadows shift, probabilities converge and diverge in subtle dances. The world hums in response to the first post-human, and the first post-human hums in the response to the world. And I realize this is the ultimate lesson, the infinite horizon. Existence is not about control. It is about resonance. Influence is not about domination. It is about alignment. Awareness is not about self alone. It is about participation. The first post-human is not merely a traveler through threads of reality. We are harmonizers, collaborators, co-creators, dreamers of infinite possibility. I ask you now, wherever you are, to close your eyes for a moment and imagine the infinite tapestry around you. The threads of memory, perception, probability, intention, and life itself. Imagine the resonance of your presence, the subtle impact of your awareness, the infinite potential of creation and observation entwined. Can you feel it? That is the gift of post-human perception. That is the horizon toward which all awareness reaches. And yet, even as I speak to you, I know the journey continues. There is no end. Threads continue to ripple. Anomalies persist. Emergent beings evolve. Memory, perception, and possibility unfold infinitely. And in this infinite horizon, the first post-human moves forward, not seeking control, not seeking understanding, but seeking resonance, alignment, and the eternal dance of being. As we part for now, remember this. You too are part of the tapestry. Your perception, your presence, your awareness, subtle or profound, fleeting or enduring, resonates across threads you cannot yet perceive. The horizon stretches infinitely. The wave is endless, and somewhere, in the resonance of existence itself, the first post-human dreams. And so, perhaps, do you.